Okay, so I asked to go last because my talk is a little bit different. So we've listened all day to songs about teaching people science, and now in the last few talks in this panel, we've gradually expanded from that a little bit. So Jennifer was talking about musicians singing about the environment, and Johnny just talked about writing songs with people who normally don't do that. So I'm coming to this from yet another direction. This is a little bit about me. The picture to the left is taken in the week that I defended my PhD thesis in biochemistry and also played violin in the Christmas concert. For the entire duration of my career in science, and after that working in science publishing and working in science communication, I have also always been actively playing violin in various orchestras. And when I started asking around, a lot of other people were doing the same thing. So my orchestras have always been filled with lots of scientists, and whenever I talk to scientists about my violin, or when they see me carrying my case around, they come up to me and they tell me about their own music projects. So a few years ago, I did a survey asking people about their involvement in both music and science, or either one or the other. And I got a very long list of names of people who all, in one way or another, do things with music and science. So one of the aspects is what we've been hearing about all day, is using music to teach science, but there are lots of other ways in which these fields overlap. I started writing a newsletter, NewsSci Quarterly, that comes out 4 times a year, and it's got a couple of hundred subscribers. I'll put a link in the last slide. And I've also written a book proposal that looks much broader at the overlap between what musicians do and what scientists do. I'm currently trying to find an agent for that, but it's apparently as hard as finding funding for music videos about science. So we'll see how that goes. But what I want to talk about today is one specific aspect that I came across when I was looking at this overlap that I thought was very interesting. And it is one type of music. I hope this is going to give you the audio. So while I'm going to, this is just a 1-minute clip that I've made out of 3 YouTube videos. And while I'm playing this, I just want you to think about, and type in the chat box if you feel like it, who the audience is for these 3 songs. And if you answer that quite quickly and you want to type more, you can also talk about what the songs are based on, because they're all 3 of them happen to be parodies. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Does that work?
Denaturing and kneeling and extending. Well, it's amazing what heating and cooling and heating will do. PCR.
Western baby, figure 1 will be amazing. Lot, Western baby, transfer this exposure's hazy.
She's up all night to the sun. I'm up all night to get some. She's up all night for good fun. We're up all night to get data. We're up all night to patch plans. We're up all night for GCAM. We're up all night to write grants. We're up all night to get data.
Okay, that was it. So who are these songs for? They're not for students, and yeah, exactly, I see it come up, scientists. So these are all songs that are written for scientists, for other scientists. So the first song was an advertisement aimed at genetics or biology researchers who purchase PCR machines. Greg says he doesn't think it's a parody. I don't know if you would call it a parody, but if you look at the video and then look at the video for the 1980s, I think it's called Artists for Africa or USA for Africa. the We Are the World song, it's almost an identical video. So even though the melody is different, it's very clearly inspired by that. Bad Project is based on Lady Gaga's Bad Romance, created for colleagues at the Molecular and Human Genetics Retreat at Baylor College of Medicine. It's my favorite of the three I just showed you. And Get Data is an invitation for people to attend a social event at a neuroscience conference, and it's based on Daft Punk's Get Lucky. So in all three cases, they're based on, they're aimed at other scientists, and they're a bit different because they're not really trying to teach you something, but they do all have a few things in common. So they're very jargon rich. Like, I've really enjoyed that Bad Project because I work in a similar lab and I understood all the references. I have also had to look at lab books written in different languages and try to deal with tubes with the labeling that I didn't understand. There's lots of in-jokes in there, but they describe a shared experience that, again, if you have worked in a similar situation, you would find it very recognizable. They're meant as entertainment for colleagues. And I don't know, this doesn't show up right, but they're often performed in the context of conferences or professional retreats. So either live or shown as a video like this. They build a sense of community. So they're essentially fan music for people who work in the same fields and who enjoy the same things. Because let's face it, even though it's work, they do kind of enjoy this. And it reminded me very strongly of something called Filk that I'd heard of. Now, Filk is, I'm just going to quote Wikipedia because I thought it was a great summary. It's a form of music created from within science fiction and fantasy fandom, often performed late at night at science fiction conventions. And the picture that you can see in the background is a Filk circle. So it's all people bring their instruments and they sit around in a circle and they sing songs about science fiction or fantasy. Although parody is not the primary focus of Filk music culture, the proportion of parody songs found in Filk is higher than in other musical cultures. So that, again, that sounds very familiar. Now, before I continue, I have a question for you all, or actually two questions. The first is, have you heard of this genre of music before? And if you have, did any of you self-identify as a Filk musician? And I will get back to that later. So here are a couple of examples, just so you get an idea of what it is. Aha, yes and yes, perfect. Oh, let me go back. So here's one about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This isn't a parody, this is an original melody. You Bash the Balrog, I'm not going to sing it, but it's on to the tune of Waltzing Matilda. And this is a Star Trek songs and ballads songbook, so that when you are in a group of people, you can pass the lyrics around and start singing it. And this looks quite old because this has been happening for decades, pre-internet. So right now you could just like email someone the lyrics and say that this is the song that I wrote, this is what we're singing. But this dates from the dates that, you know, photocopies and staples. I think this is from the early 70s, perhaps. So this made me wonder, are these kinds of science songs that people sing for their colleagues similar to this? And would you categorize it in the same way? Because say they're both about a niche interest, they're both kind of often performed at gatherings with people who have the same interests. They're often parodies, not always. And there are Filk musicians who include songs about science in their repertoire. And I've already seen people identifying themselves as Filkers in the comments here. So let's investigate. To answer this question, I actually found a great comparison to look at. And that is a study that looks, that tries to find out whether a different type of music is Filk music. And now we're going to go way off base. I have to tell you about wizard rock. Wizard rock has nothing to do with science. wizard rock bands were popular in the early 2000s. I think some of them still exist, and they perform songs about the world of Harry Potter. And the audience for these songs is other Harry Potter fans, and it always happens at Harry Potter themed events, or they'll have like a separate show just for the fans of the music. And again, they include parodies as well as original songs. I think these include a bit more original songs than the other two genres we just talked about. So by this description, wizard rock seems like it should be a subtype of folk music, but instead of covering all of science fiction or fantasy, they're just limited to this very specific fantasy genre, just this one series of 7 books. And now someone has actually written an academic paper trying to answer the question, is wizard rock filk? There's a reference at the bottom of the screen. It's a 2009 paper by Melissa Tatum. And after going through, she basically tried to answer 2 separate questions, as what is filk music, what is wizard rock, and then is wizard rock filk? And she found that it really depends on the point of view. For example, if you define filk as being only based on the subject matter of the music, like it just has to be music about science fiction or fantasy, then yes, wizard rock falls in that category. But if you say no, because the act of performing it at a science fiction conference, in a filk circle, that's what it's all about. Wizard rock is not like that at all. It's bands performing on stage, so then it's not like that. But one important thing that she found was that a big disagreement in the filk community, or a big matter of debate, is whether you should identify yourself as a filk musician to be considered one. And wizard rock community does not self-identify as filk. They just identify as Harry Potter fans. They identify as musicians, and that's it. Like some of you, they've never heard of filk before, so they can't be part of that community. That's what some people say, and then others might again disagree and say, well, no, because it's all just about the subject matter, so they are part of it. Now, if you bring that back to our science songs, it's kind of the same story, where okay, there is some overlap in performance setting, but then when you start looking at the subject matter, it's not about science fiction or fantasy, it's all about science. So again, some people might say, no, these songs are not filk songs, and others might say they are. But again, what I think an important point is whether or not you identify yourself as a filk musician. So if you go to the website of, I think it's pronounced Paul Schuck, Dr. Sethi, he clearly identifies himself as a filk musician. And he thinks about the SETI experiments, extraterrestrial life. He explains a lot of space science. So there's a lot of science in his songs, and he calls his music filk. But if you don't identify as that, then maybe that's not your type of music. But if it isn't, the next question is, well, then what is it? And I drew this crazy, impossibly to interpret Venn diagram that just sort of to show it can be different things. So we've heard a lot this morning about this category. So it's music about science, but it's also educational music. And the videos that I showed you earlier are more in this area. So maybe a little bit educational, but mostly not really. And I would say that there's a broader category that encompasses both what I showed you earlier and the entirety of wizard rock and filk music, and that's that green oval I drew here, and whatever you want to call it, fan music, or just singing about things we love, just singing about a shared interest for the sole purpose of creating a community activity and bonding with people with the same interests. So there are definitely similarities, and there is some overlap with educational music, but for the most part, it doesn't have to be educational. So it's kind of it's all a very fuzzy area. And that's, yeah, I try to classify this as part of like my whole journey of figuring out what the overlaps are between music and science. So I did, it's nothing academic. I would say my talk is probably the least academic one you've seen today. My degree is in biochemistry, my day job is in science communication, and music is just my hobby. So I tried to synthesize it all a bit for this book proposal, and just to, to get my thoughts in order. But when I found out about Filk, which was only in doing the research for this, I just got really interested in the whole community. So I'm glad to see there are some people here who do indeed identify as Filk musicians. So maybe you can tell me a bit more about that later. I have all my contact info here. I have my email address. I have 2 music-related Twitter accounts, Eastern Blood and USI. And the newsletter I mentioned on the first slide, you can access on the newsletters page of my website. So I think I should stop sharing my screen, and then we can go to the Q&A for everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds great, Eva. Thank you very much for your contribution. And thanks to the speakers watching the time carefully, we now have a nice 15-minute or 20-minute chunk for questions. So let's use that chat window, people. Here we go. And these are, of course, questions for all 3 speakers, not just Eva, and you can direct your questions as needed.